What if the reason you feel alone right now is not because you've been abandoned, but because you've been chosen? What if the distance you're experiencing, the silence, the loss, is not random, but necessary? Because before elevation comes isolation, and before purpose comes separation. In this message, we're going to uncover why what you're losing may be making space for who you're meant to become. Separation is not rejection. One of the most painful experiences in life is the feeling of being rejected, to be left out, to be overlooked, to be distanced from people or places that once felt secure. When separation begins to happen, the natural human reaction is to interpret it as loss. You assume something has gone wrong. You begin to question your worth, your decisions, even your identity. Why am I being pushed away? Why are things falling apart? Why does it feel like I no longer belong? But what feels like rejection is often something far more intentional. Separation is not always a sign that you are unwanted. Sometimes it is a sign that you are being redirected, because not every closed door is punishment. Not every ending is failure. Not every distancing is abandonment. There are moments when removal is protection. There are relationships that would have limited your growth, environments that would have diluted your values, paths that would have slowly led you away from who you were meant to become. And yet, while you were inside them, they felt normal, familiar, even necessary. So when separation happens, it feels violent, sudden, personal. But what if the removal is not about your inadequacy? What if it is about your preservation? Sometimes the very thing you're grieving was never meant to sustain your future. What feels like rejection is actually rescue. You were not pushed out because you lacked value. You were moved because you carried potential that could not survive where you were. There are seasons in life where staying connected would have cost you clarity, where belonging would have required compromise, where acceptance would have demanded silence from your convictions, and so distance becomes necessary, not to isolate you in punishment, but to position you in alignment, because growth cannot occur where you are constantly pressured to remain small. Calling cannot develop in places that reward comfort over truth. Purpose cannot mature in environments that demand conformity instead of integrity. Separation becomes the moment where illusion breaks. You begin to see what once blinded you. You begin to feel the weight of influences you didn't notice before. You begin to recognize that what you called stability may have actually been stagnation. So the loss hurts. But the hurt is not proof of rejection. It is proof of transition. You are moving from dependency to identity, from approval to conviction, from belonging everywhere to belonging where it matters. Separation is not a declaration of your unworthiness. It is often a declaration that you are being called into something that requires refinement. And refinement demands removal. Not everything that leaves your life is meant to be chased. Some things are meant to be released, because rejection says you are not wanted, but separation says you are being prepared. Preparation requires distance. There is a truth that is difficult to accept. You cannot grow into who you are meant to become while remaining in every place you have been. Preparation always requires distance. Distance from what is familiar, distance from what is comfortable, distance from what once defined you. Because growth is not only about what is added to your life, it is also about what is removed. Many people believe preparation looks like gaining new opportunities, new knowledge, or new strength. But often, preparation begins with subtraction. Certain voices grow quieter, certain relationships fade, certain environments begin to feel restrictive instead of safe. And this distance can feel confusing. You may wonder, why do I feel disconnected from what once felt right? Why do I no longer fit where I used to belong? It is not because you have become arrogant. It is not because you have outgrown people and pride. It is because preparation changes your sensitivity. You begin to notice things you once ignored. You become aware of influences that shape your thinking. You recognize patterns that once seemed harmless, but now feel limiting, and slowly distance forms, not always dramatically, not always intentionally, but necessarily, because you cannot prepare for clarity while surrounded by confusion. You cannot develop conviction while constantly pressured to compromise. You cannot learn discipline in an environment that rewards comfort. Distance creates space. space to think without interference, space to choose without pressure, space to hear without noise. Without that space, preparation becomes impossible. Every great transformation begins in some form of separation. Athletes withdraw into training. Leaders step back to reflect. Creators retreat to refine, not because they reject the world, but because they must strengthen themselves before re-entering it. The same is true in personal and spiritual growth. Preparation is not meant to happen in chaos. It requires stillness. It requires clarity. It requires environments where truth is not constantly negotiated. And sometimes that means stepping away from approval that weakens your resolve, habits that blur your focus, circles that normalize compromise. This distance is not cruelty, it is strategy, because what you are being shaped into cannot survive constant distraction. What you are being prepared for cannot coexist with environments that pull you backward. Distance allows identity to form without interference. It allows values to deepen without noise. And while it may feel like loss, it is actually refinement. You are not being distanced to diminish your life. You are being positioned to develop the strength required for what lies ahead. Preparation does not happen in crowds. It happens in clarity, and clarity requires distance. Before elevation comes isolation. Many people dream of elevation. They imagine growth, influence, clarity, and purpose. They long for progress, for their lives to move beyond limitation into something meaningful. But what few expect is that elevation rarely begins with recognition. It begins with isolation. There is a quiet stage that comes before advancement, a hidden season where visibility fades and solitude increases. And this stage often feels like delay, like stagnation, like being overlooked. While others seem to move forward, you may feel as though you have been pulled aside. Conversations change, connections weaken, opportunities seem to pause, and the natural response is frustration. Why am I being held back? Why does it feel like I'm stuck while others rise? But isolation is not the absence of progress. It is the environment where progress is formed. Because elevation without preparation leads to collapse, strength must develop before responsibility expands. Conviction must deepen before influence grows. Identity must stabilize before visibility increases. And none of that happens effectively in constant exposure. Isolation removes the noise. Without applause, you discover whether your motivation was approval or purpose. Without constant interaction, you discover whether your direction was chosen or borrowed. Without distraction, you begin to see yourself more honestly. This can be uncomfortable because in isolation you are confronted with your habits, your fears, your inconsistencies. There are no crowds to affirm you, no distractions to numb you, only silence. And in that silence, refinement begins. Isolation forces discipline. It builds resilience without dependency on validation, because elevation attracts attention, and attention amplifies weakness if weakness is not addressed beforehand. So before responsibility expands, character must be strengthened. Before leadership develops, self-mastery must form. Before influence increases, integrity must be tested. Isolation becomes the training ground for these things. It strips away performance. It removes imitation. It challenges whether your growth is real or merely external. Without isolation, elevation becomes dangerous, because without internal stability, external success magnifies instability. Isolation is not the end of your path. It is the hidden construction phase. It is where depth replaces image, where endurance replaces excitement, where conviction replaces convenience. While others may see absence, something is being built beneath the surface. Foundations are forming. Strength is stabilizing. Direction is becoming clearer. So when isolation comes, it should not always be interpreted as exclusion. Sometimes it is protection from premature exposure. Sometimes it is the pause before responsibility, because true elevation does not begin in the spotlight. It begins in the quiet, where the person you are becoming is shaped before the world ever sees it. Loss creates space. Loss is one of the most misunderstood experiences in life. When something leaves, a relationship, an opportunity, a role, a season, the immediate response is grief. You feel the absence. You feel the disruption. You feel the emptiness where something once existed. And the instinct is to fill that emptiness as quickly as possible, to replace what was lost, to restore what disappeared, to return to what felt full. But what if the emptiness is not the problem? What if the space created by loss is the very thing that makes growth possible? Because fullness is not always health. Sometimes what fills your life also confines it. You can be surrounded and still stagnant, busy and still directionless, connected and still unfulfilled. Not because you lack effort, but because there is no room for change. When everything is occupied, nothing can be transformed. Loss interrupts that occupation. It removes what once consumed your time, your energy, your attention. And in doing so, it creates space. Space that initially feels uncomfortable. Because space is unfamiliar, without constant activity, you are left with stillness. Without constant affirmation, you are left with reflection. Without constant attachment, you are left with awareness. And awareness often reveals truths that were previously hidden beneath noise. Loss slows the pace. It interrupts patterns. It forces you to pause long enough to ask, was this helping me grow? Was this shaping who I want to become? Was this aligned with my deeper direction? Questions that rarely surface when life is crowded. Because clarity does not emerge in congestion, it emerges in openness. Loss clears what once filled your vision. It removes what once dictated your priorities. It dismantles structures that may have felt stable but limited your movement. And in their absence, space appears. This space allows new thought, new direction, new conviction. Without space, newness cannot enter. You cannot build while everything is already occupied. You cannot redefine while everything is already defined. You cannot grow while everything remains fixed. Loss becomes the moment where life loosens its grip on what once held it in place. It may feel like collapse, but often it is release, because what leaves creates room to reassess your values, room to notice where your energy is truly needed, room to pursue paths that were previously inaccessible, and most importantly, room to change. Growth requires openness, and openness requires space. Space to experiment, space to become something different than what you were. Without loss, many remain locked in patterns simply because they are full. Full schedules, full expectations, full attachments, but fullness can prevent transformation. Loss breaks that illusion. It reminds you that what was once central is not always essential. It invites you to reconsider what deserves to remain and what needed to go. So while loss feels like subtraction, it often functions as preparation. It clears what was occupying your life without necessarily advancing it. It removes what prevented deeper alignment. It creates an openness where something stronger can take root. Because nothing new can grow in a space that refuses to open. And sometimes loss is the only force powerful enough to create that opening. Expand point 5 into 600 words. 5. Purpose cannot grow in chaos. Purpose requires direction. But chaos destroys direction. It scatters attention, weakens focus, and replaces clarity with constant reaction. When life becomes chaotic, everything feels urgent. Every problem demands energy. Every distraction, are as important. And in that environment, purpose quietly suffocates, not because it disappears, but because it cannot be heard. Chaos is loud. It fills your days with noise and your mind with urgency. You move from one demand to another, from one concern to the next, without ever stepping back long enough to ask, where am I actually going? Purpose does not grow in constant motion. It grows in intentional movement, and intentional movement requires clarity. But chaos blurs clarity. When everything feels equally important, nothing is truly prioritized. You begin reacting instead of choosing, surviving instead of building. Chaos keeps you occupied, but occupation is not the same as progress. You can be extremely busy while moving nowhere meaningful. Because purpose is not built through random effort. It is built through focused direction. And focus cannot exist where disorder dominates. When your environment is filled with constant interruption, your mind learns to adapt to distraction. When your schedule is packed with urgency, your decisions become reactive. When your relationships are filled with instability, your emotional energy is drained. And slowly the space required for deeper thought disappears. Purpose needs stillness, not inactivity, but order. Order in thought, order in priorities, order in action. Without order, you may act often, but advance little. Chaos fragments your energy. Instead of investing deeply in what matters, you spread yourself thin across what demands attention, and purpose cannot develop in fragments. It requires continuity, consistency, alignment. Chaos breaks alignment. It pulls you into conflicting directions. It invites you to commit to what is immediate rather than what is meaningful. It trains you to value urgency over importance. And over time, this creates a life driven by reaction rather than intention. Purpose is not discovered through reaction. It is discovered through reflection. And reflection requires quiet. Without moments of calm, you cannot evaluate your path. Without distance from disorder, you cannot see your direction. Without boundaries, you cannot protect your focus. This is why environments matter. Surroundings shape thought. Noise shapes priorities. Instability shapes decision-making. When everything around you is unpredictable, you begin to live defensively, preparing for the next disruption, anticipating the next demand, managing the next crisis. And in this state, long-term vision fades. Purpose requires forward thinking, but chaos traps you in the present moment. It forces you to constantly respond rather than intentionally create. So order becomes essential. Not rigid control, but structured clarity, clear priorities, clear boundaries, clear direction. With order, attention stabilizes. With stability, focus strengthens. With focus, meaningful action becomes possible. Purpose grows where energy is directed, not scattered, where time is invested, not consumed, where thought is intentional, not overwhelmed. Chaos may feel productive because it keeps you moving, but movement without direction is drift, and purpose cannot take root in drift. It requires ground that is steady, space that is calm, a life that is aligned enough to allow depth. Because purpose is not built in noise, it is built where clarity has room to exist. Expand point 5 into 400 words. 5. Purpose cannot grow in chaos. Purpose needs clarity to survive. But chaos destroys clarity. When life becomes noisy and disordered, everything begins to compete for your attention. Every task feels urgent. Every voice feels important. Every problem demands immediate response. And in the middle of all this, pose gets buried, not because it disappears, but because it cannot rise in confusion. Chaos keeps you busy, but busyness is not direction. You may be constantly moving, constantly solving problems, constantly responding to demands, yet still feel like you are going nowhere meaningful. Because purpose is not built through reaction, it is built through intention. And intention requires order. When your environment is chaotic, your focus becomes scattered. Instead of choosing what matters most, you respond to what shouts the loudest. Instead of building long-term direction, you manage short-term pressure. Instead of acting with purpose, you act out of urgency. This slowly trains your mind to live in survival mode, always responding, never directing. And survival mode leaves no room for vision. Purpose requires reflection. It requires time to think, time to evaluate, time to recognize what truly matters. But chaos eliminates that space. When your schedule is filled with constant interruption, your priorities become unclear. When your surroundings are unstable, your decisions become reactive. When your attention is divided, your progress becomes shallow. Purpose cannot grow in shallow effort. It requires depth, consistency, alignment. Without order, energy is wasted on things that do not advance your direction. You may work harder but move less. You may try more but achieve less, because chaos fragments your strength. Instead of investing deeply into meaningful action, you spread yourself thin across distractions. Purpose grows where attention is protected, where priorities are clear, where space exists for thoughtful action. Order does not mean perfection. It means intentional structure. Boundaries that guard your time. focus that protects your direction, clarity that guides your decisions. With order, your actions begin to align with your deeper path. With alignment, your efforts become meaningful. And with meaning, purpose finally has room to grow. Because purpose cannot take root in confusion. It grows where life becomes calm enough to hear what truly matters. God removes what weakens you. Not everything that feels good is good for you. Some things stay in your life not because they strengthen you, but because they comfort you. Approval that keeps you from speaking truth. Habits that make life easier but keep you undisciplined. Environments that accept you but never challenge you to grow. These things don't always appear harmful. In fact, they often feel safe, familiar, even necessary. But over time, they quietly weaken your resolve. Constant approval can make you dependent on validation. Easy habits can dull your discipline. Comfortable environments can lower your standards. And slowly, without realizing it, you begin to trade growth for ease. This is why removal sometimes becomes necessary, not as punishment, but as protection, because strength cannot develop where weakness is constantly reinforced. Conviction cannot grow where compromise is rewarded. Clarity cannot form where confusion is normalized. When certain supports disappear, it may feel unsettling. You may feel exposed, less confident, less secure. But what has been removed may have been preventing resilience, preventing depth. Some influences soften your edges in ways that make you less capable of standing firm when difficulty comes. So removal creates the opportunity for strength. Without constant approval, you learn conviction. Without easy patterns, you develop discipline. Without familiar comfort, you build endurance. What is taken away is not always what you needed to survive, but what you had grown used to relying on. And reliance on weakness limits growth. Removal creates the space where stronger foundations can form, because you cannot build strength while holding on to what keeps you fragile. Transformation requires comfort to die. Comfort feels safe. It creates familiarity, predictability, and ease. It allows you to move through life without resistance. But what makes comfort appealing also makes it limiting, because comfort encourages repetition. You stay where things are known. You choose what requires little effort. You avoid what feels uncertain, and slowly comfort becomes a boundary, not an external one, but an internal one. It shapes your decisions. You begin to prioritize what feels easy over what builds strength. You choose what maintains stability instead of what promotes growth. You remain in patterns that feel secure, even if they prevent progress. Transformation challenges this, because transformation is not built on familiarity. It is built on change, and change requires discomfort. To become something different, you must release what keeps you the same. That often means letting go of routines that once defined you, stepping away from environments that once supported you, facing uncertainties that comfort once shielded you from. This is why comfort cannot remain untouched during transformation. It must give way, because growth requires tension, new skills require effort, new directions require risk, new identity requires unfamiliar choices. Comfort resists all of this. It whispers that stability is enough, that maintaining is safer than evolving, that familiarity is preferable to possibility. But transformation asks a different question. Is ease worth limitation? Is familiarity worth unfulfilled potential? When comfort dominates, change feels threatening. When comfort loosens, change becomes possible. Letting go of comfort does not mean embracing chaos. It means choosing progress over predictability, choosing development over ease, choosing long-term strength over short-term relief. The loss of comfort often feels like instability, but in reality, it is the opening where growth begins, because you cannot become new while remaining attached to what keeps you unchanged. Transformation requires movement, and movement requires leaving behind what once felt safe. Comfort does not always disappear all at once. It fades as you begin to act differently, as you step into unfamiliar challenges, as you choose what builds rather than what soothes. This process may feel unsettling, but it is necessary, because comfort preserves who you are. Transformation requires you to become more than that. Silence builds strength. Silence is often misunderstood. It can feel empty, uncomfortable, even unsettling. Without constant conversation, distraction, or noise, you are left alone with your thoughts. And many try to avoid this because silence removes the usual supports, the opinions, the approval, the activity that fills your attention. But what silence removes externally, it strengthens internally. In silence, you are no longer reacting to every voice around you. You begin to hear your own convictions more clearly. Without constant feedback, you are forced to decide what you truly believe. Without constant distraction, you begin to notice your habits, your patterns, your motivations. Silence exposes what noise hides, and in that exposure, strength begins to form. Because strength is not built through constant reassurance. It is built through reflection, through learning to stand without immediate validation, through making decisions without needing approval. Silence creates space for this. It allows patience to develop. It teaches endurance. It challenges your dependence on external affirmation. When you are not constantly affirmed, you must learn to affirm your direction through conviction. When you are not constantly guided, you must learn to choose deliberately. This builds stability. Not the stability of comfort, but the stability of clarity. In silence, your values deepen, your focus sharpens, your resilience grows. Because you are no longer carried by noise, you are strengthened by understanding. Silence may feel isolating at first, but over time it becomes grounding, because within it, you discover that strength does not come from constant reinforcement. It comes from knowing where you stand, even when no one else is speaking. Separation is alignment. Separation often feels like disruption. Things shift, people leave, paths close, and it can seem as though life is becoming disordered. But sometimes separation is not disorder. It is alignment. Alignment happens when your direction begins to match your deeper purpose, and not everything in your life is meant to travel that path with you. Some relationships were suited for a different season. Some environments supported who you were, but not who you are becoming. Some patterns fit your past but conflict with your future. Separation creates the distance needed to bring your life into coherence. It removes what pulls you in conflicting directions. It loosens attachments that keep you tied to outdated roles. It clears influences that blur your focus. Without this adjustment, you may remain connected to what no longer supports your growth. You may continue investing energy into what limits your direction. You may stay aligned with expectations that do not match your evolving values. Separation interrupts this. It creates the opportunity to reposition, to reevaluate, to choose what truly fits the path ahead. Alignment is not about becoming distant for its own sake. It is about ensuring that your environment, actions, and commitments move in the same direction. Without alignment, effort is divided. With alignment, effort becomes effective. Separation helps remove what divides your focus. It simplifies your direction. It allows your energy to move toward what truly matters. What feels like loss may actually be adjustment, a necessary step toward coherence. Because growth is not only about gaining new things, it is also about releasing what no longer belongs. Separation makes that release possible, and through it, alignment begins to take shape. Isolation is the beginning, not the end. Isolation often feels final. When connection fades and familiarity disappears, it can seem like something has ended, like progress has stopped, like direction has been lost. But isolation is rarely an ending. It is a beginning. It marks the moment when external influences grow quieter and internal development becomes possible. Without constant interaction, you gain space to reflect. Without ongoing distraction, you gain clarity. Without dependence on approval, you begin to build conviction. Isolation shifts your focus inward. It allows you to examine your values, your habits, your direction. It creates the conditions where identity can strengthen without interference. What feels like emptiness becomes opportunity, opportunity to define rather than imitate, to choose rather than follow, to build rather than maintain. Isolation prepares you for what comes next. It is the stage where foundations form before expansion begins, where depth develops before visibility increases. Rather than signaling loss, isolation signals transition, a movement from external reliance to internal stability. It is not the closing of your path. It is the preparation for a new one.